The church bells echoed softly in the distance as the morning sun painted the sky with shades of gold and rose. I remember how I looked at myself in the mirror that day, my white dress flowing like a river of promises, and I believed with every piece of my heart that I was about to step into the most beautiful chapter of my life. Every stitch of lace carried not only tradition, but also the fragile hope of a woman who dreamed of being loved, cherished, and safe. The smell of flowers filled the air, roses and lilies arranged with perfection, as if the world itself was conspiring to create a scene of pure happiness. I wanted to believe that this was fate, that I had been chosen for a life of love and belonging, and for those first fleeting hours, I allowed myself to live inside that illusion. When I walked down the aisle, the eyes of my family, my friends, and even strangers were fixed on me, radiating admiration and warmth. Some of them wiped tears from their eyes, convinced they were witnessing the embodiment of a fairy tale. I smiled at them, not knowing that my smile would soon become a memory I would struggle to recognize. Every vow spoken by him that day, every phrase uttered in front of God and everyone, was delivered with the conviction of a man who had mastered the art of deception. His hands held mine, his lips pressed against mine in a kiss that was supposed to seal forever, and yet hidden behind his gestures was a darkness I could not see. The music was soft, the candles flickered like guardians of romance, and as we turned to face the guests as husband and wife, I felt an almost painful rush of joy. I thought I was safe, that I was chosen, that life had finally rewarded me with a partner who would never let me go. People clapped and cheered, glasses were raised, and children threw petals at our feet. I was radiant, not because I was beautiful, but because I believed I was loved. In those moments of bliss, the world seemed to disappear, and I clung to the idea that happiness had finally found me. I had spent years carrying wounds from childhood, moments when love had felt conditional, moments when silence in my family home had taught me to bury pain rather than speak it. On that day, dressed in white and standing beside him, I thought all of that was behind me. It felt as if my life had finally been rewritten into something new, something safe. That belief wrapped itself around me like a shield, fragile but comforting, and I closed my eyes to savor it. Guests whispered about how perfect we looked together. Some said we were destined, that our story was like one of those love tales people wish to live but rarely achieve. I let their words soak into me because I wanted so desperately to believe them. I wanted to be the woman who conquered loneliness, the woman who finally found a man who saw her as more than fragile or broken. I wanted to feel whole again, and in those hours of celebration, I thought I had finally achieved that wholeness. But even in the brightness of that day, there were shadows I refused to see, little details that now replay in my memory with terrifying clarity. The way his grip on my hand felt slightly too firm when we posed for pictures. The way his smile looked polished, but his eyes remained cold, detached, as if he were playing a role on stage. At the time, I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was only the stress of the day, the pressure of being the center of attention. I ignored the chill in my spine because I wanted the illusion more than I wanted the truth. The truth is that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are built out of hope. I had dreamed of this wedding since I was a little girl, sewing dresses for my dolls and imagining a man who would sweep me off my feet. That little girl inside me still craved rescue, still longed for a love strong enough to erase the scars of my past. And on that day, in front of everyone, I thought I had found it. I thought I had been rescued. But the cruelest trap is the one that disguises itself as salvation, and I walked willingly into it. Even as the laughter echoed around me, I felt something unsettled deep in my chest, a tiny voice whispering that joy, this perfect, cannot last. Yet I silenced it because hope is intoxicating. It blinds you, it deafens you, it convinces you to ignore the warning signs. My heart beat fast, not only from happiness, but also from a strange unease I could not name. My body knew what my mind refused to accept. That day will forever live inside me, not because of the beauty of the flowers or the music or the gown, but because it was the beginning of the cruelest revelation of my life. While I believed I was stepping into the warmth of love, I was already standing at the edge of a shadow I could not yet see. Every cheer from the guests, every hug from relatives, every flash of a camera captured not the start of my freedom, but the last moments of it. And while I held onto his hand, smiling for the world, I was unknowingly stepping into a story that would strip me of everything I thought I was. That is the memory of my wedding day, a day that promised forever, but instead opened the door to a darkness that would change me in ways I could never have imagined. The reception hall was filled with laughter and the sound of clinking glasses, a celebration that seemed endless as people toasted to love and new beginnings. The music played softly in the background, and the air smelled of perfume and wine, a mixture of joy and excess that marked every wedding feast. I was smiling, shaking hands, and receiving congratulations, still wrapped in the glow of my wedding dress, still believing in the illusion of a perfect start. To the eyes of everyone there, I was a woman blessed, chosen, radiant in her happiness. But beneath that fragile veil of joy, something darker was waiting to reveal itself, something that would change the meaning of that day forever. He approached me quietly, almost unnoticed, his expression still carrying the charm that deceived everyone else. He leaned towards me, and before I could process what was happening, his hand gripped my arm with a force that did not belong in a celebration of love. It was not a gentle touch, not the caress of a husband who cherished his bride, but the clamp of possession, the grip of someone who wanted control. I tried to keep my smile for the guests who stood nearby, but his fingers dug deeper into my skin, and for the first time, I saw a shadow flicker across his face. As I looked into his eyes, I no longer saw the polished image he had shown during the ceremony. His gaze was colder now, stripped of its disguise, revealing something hard and merciless that made my stomach tighten with dread. He bent closer, his lips brushing my ear so that only I could hear him. His voice was sharp, steady, and filled with venom. He whispered that I would never be free. The words were short, but they carried the weight of a lifetime sentence. In the midst of laughter and celebration, I felt the floor disappear beneath me. My body froze. My heart pounded against my ribs as if trying to escape. I looked around, desperate for a face that might notice the terror building inside me, but everyone was too busy raising glasses, telling stories, dancing under the glow of chandeliers. No one saw the shift. No one saw how my smile had cracked, how my shoulders stiffened under the pressure of his hand. I was alone in a room full of people who believed they were witnessing love, while I stood at the edge of something sinister. He pulled me away with calculated strength, guiding me through the crowd like a puppet on invisible strings. I felt the fabric of my dress catching on chairs, brushing against tables, but no one stopped us. Guests stepped aside, thinking it was nothing more than a groom eager to steal a private moment with his bride. The irony of it cut deeper than any blade. They thought they were witnessing romance, when in truth they were witnessing the beginning of my imprisonment. When the doors closed behind us, the noise of the reception faded into a muffled hum, like laughter buried underwater. The silence of the hallway wrapped around me, and I suddenly realized how powerless I was. My dress, the very symbol of purity and celebration, now felt like a cage of fabric weighing me down, keeping me from moving freely. I tried to pull my arm away, but his grip tightened, leaving marks that burned on my skin. His smile had vanished completely, replaced by a mask of ownership that stripped away every illusion I had clung to. I whispered his name, hoping to reach the man I thought I knew, the man who had promised to love me. But he only stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes void of tenderness. He told me that everything I had believed was a lie, that I belonged to him in a way I had not yet understood, and that from that moment on, I would live by his rules. Each word fell heavy in the air, carving itself into me like a scar that would never heal. The sound of music seeped faintly through the walls, mocking me with its joy. I could hear the rhythm of dancing feet and the bursts of applause, sounds that belonged to a celebration I was no longer part of. I thought of the faces of my family, laughing, clinking glasses, unaware of the storm unraveling just a few steps away. I wanted to scream, to call out, but the fear in his eyes warned me that silence was my only shield. My voice was locked in my throat, swallowed by the dread that had begun to consume me. I realized then that the ceremony had been nothing more than a performance, a carefully staged play meant to convince the world of his devotion. But the vows, the kiss, the applause, all of it had been a mask. Behind the mask was a man who viewed me not as a partner, not as a wife, but as possession. That truth settled into my bones with a coldness I could not shake. The fairy tale I had dreamed of had ended before the ink on our vows had even dried. His hand never released me, even as I tried to steady my breath. Each step he forced me to take felt like a descent into a place I had never imagined for myself, a place where love was twisted into control and tenderness into cruelty. And as the music carried on in the distance, I felt myself being pulled further away from the light of celebration and deeper into the shadows of a life I had not chosen. The door slammed shut behind me, and the echo of the lock twisting in place felt louder than the music that still seeped faintly from above. My body trembled as I was shoved into the darkness of the basement, a place that smelled of damp stone and rotting wood. The air was heavy and suffocating, filled with the scent of mold and old dust that clung to my throat. I could still hear the faint laughter of guests, the muffled rhythm of music, and the clinking of glasses. It was surreal, as if two worlds existed at once, one of celebration and light just above me, and another of despair and silence that swallowed me whole below. I tried to adjust my eyes to the dim light, but the basement was nearly black, the only illumination coming from a weak bulb that flickered in the corner, casting shadows that twisted across the walls like cruel phantoms. The floor was cold beneath my shoes, and my wedding dress dragged against the dirt, staining the fabric that hours earlier had seemed so pure and untouchable. Each breath felt heavier, as if the room itself was pressing down on me, reminding me that I was not free. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the rough concrete scrape my skin, and the sensation burned into me like the reality of my captivity. The contrast was unbearable. Above me, I could hear my name being toasted, guests clapping their hands, oblivious to the fact that the bride they celebrated was hidden away in a cage of shadows. I thought of my mother's voice, probably laughing, perhaps raising a glass, completely unaware of the terror unfolding beneath her feet. My heart screamed for someone to notice, for someone to question where I had gone, but no one came. The silence of the basement was broken only by my own shallow breaths and the faint vibrations of music that mocked me with every beat. I sat on the ground, the layers of my dress pooling around me, and felt the icy dampness seep through to my skin. Every detail of the room seemed designed to erase dignity. The cobwebs in the corners, the smell of rusted pipes, the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. It was a space that belonged to forgotten things, not to a woman on her wedding day. Yet here I was, stripped of the illusion of love, reduced to a secret hidden beneath the feet of those who thought they knew my story. Time passed in strange fragments. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like eternity. Every sound from above pierced me like a cruel reminder of what I had lost. The music shifted to faster rhythms, and I knew people were dancing, their joy building as my fear deepened. I imagined the lights glowing, the champagne flowing, the smiles widening. None of them knew that the bride had been buried alive in silence. I tried to pray, whispering words to a God I hoped had not abandoned me. But even prayer felt fragile in that space, as if the walls swallowed my pleas before they could rise. I pressed my hands against my chest to feel my heartbeat, needing to prove to myself that I was still alive, that I was more than the shadows pressing against me. The truth was inescapable. I was trapped, not just physically but emotionally, in a nightmare I had not chosen. There were moments when I thought I heard footsteps above the basement stairs, and hope would ignite inside me like a spark. I would hold my breath, waiting for the door to open, for a familiar face to appear and save me. But the footsteps always faded, replaced by laughter or applause, and the spark inside me dimmed again. Each false hope cut deeper than the last, teaching me that I was invisible to the world outside those walls. I remember running my fingers over the folds of my dress, once a symbol of purity and joy, now dirtied and torn by the roughness of the floor. I felt as if the dress itself mocked me, its whiteness now tainted by the shadows I could not escape. My reflection in that moment, had there been a mirror, would not have been that of a bride, but of a prisoner dressed in the costume of a dream. The basement grew colder as the night deepened, and I pulled my arms around myself for warmth. The silence became heavier, as if the walls were leaning closer, listening to my every thought. My body ached from sitting on the hard floor, and my mind raced with images of the life I had imagined and the reality I now faced. I thought of the vows spoken just hours earlier, of the promises of forever, and the bitter irony cut through me like a blade. Forever had begun, but it was not the forever I had been promised. Above me, the music eventually slowed, and I could hear chairs scraping across the floor, voices softening as the guests began to leave. I wondered if anyone asked where I had gone. Did they notice the absence of the bride? Or did they assume I was simply tired, resting in some room out of sight? The thought that no one searched for me pierced me more than the darkness itself. I was not only locked away in a basement, I was erased from my own wedding. I wrapped my arms tighter around my body, rocking slightly, trying to comfort myself in a space where no comfort could exist. I felt tears fall onto the fabric of my dress, and they blended with the stains of dirt and dust. I realized that night that captivity is not just walls and locks. It is the silence of others, the blindness of those who should see, and the cruelty of being hidden in plain sight. As the last echoes of laughter faded from above, the weight of the basement pressed harder against me, and I understood with terrifying clarity that this was only the beginning of my life as his prisoner. The illusion of love had been stripped away completely, and in its place stood a truth so dark that I could barely breathe under its weight. Silence is not always quiet. Sometimes it is heavier than screams, more violent than fists, and more devastating than chains. As I sat in the cold of that basement, the echo of my own breath filling the emptiness, I began to realize that what hurt me most was not only his cruelty, but the silence of everyone else. The silence of the people who should have noticed, who should have cared, who should have acted. That silence was its own form of betrayal. I thought back to the days leading up to the wedding, the little details I had brushed aside, the uncomfortable glances from relatives, the way friends hesitated before saying they were happy for me. There had been moments when people close to me had seen glimpses of the man he truly was. His temper that appeared in sudden bursts, his need to control every detail, his dismissive way of speaking to me when no one else was paying attention. But instead of confronting it, instead of protecting me, they chose to remain quiet. They told themselves it was stress, nerves, or simply his personality. They wrapped their doubts in excuses and placed ribbons over them to keep the illusion intact. At the wedding itself, I remembered how his grip on my arm had already left faint red marks, visible enough for anyone paying attention. My eyes had filled with something more than joy, something that trembled with fear. Yet nobody saw it, or perhaps they saw it and chose to look away. It is easier to ignore a shadow than to confront it. People convince themselves that happiness is fragile, and they would rather protect the image of it than destroy it with truth. So they played their part, smiling for photos, clapping at toasts, turning their heads when the cracks began to show. What made it unbearable was the realization that their silence had not begun at the wedding. It had been present long before. My family had seen the way he spoke to me, controlling and dismissive, yet they called it care. They had heard the sharpness in his tone when I disagreed with him, but they disguised it as passion. They noticed how he isolated me, limiting the time I spent with friends, but they excused it as love and protection. Each warning sign was camouflaged by the comfort of denial. It was easier for them to pretend than to intervene. In many cultures, silence is a dangerous tradition. Families often protect appearances over individuals, sacrificing truth to preserve the image of stability. Women especially are told to endure, to forgive, to keep private matters hidden behind closed doors. This silence becomes a cage passed down through generations, a legacy of looking away, and I was now another link in that chain. My pain was not only inflicted by him, but also by the countless eyes that chose blindness, the ears that chose deafness, and the mouths that chose to remain closed. I remember imagining my mother's face upstairs as she laughed with the guests, perhaps even proud that her daughter had finally married. Would she have noticed my absence? Did she wonder why her daughter disappeared from her own celebration? Or did she convince herself I was fine, unwilling to let her mind wander into the uncomfortable possibility that something was wrong? Silence often comes dressed as denial, and denial is a comfortable shield for those who do not want to face the horror staring back at them. The weight of this realization pressed down on me with the same intensity as the locked door above. I felt abandoned, not only by the man who had sworn to love me, but by the very community that was supposed to protect me. It was as though I had been erased from their reality. My suffering was invisible, swallowed by the need to maintain appearances, and their silence became a cruel accomplice to his violence. Even in the days that followed, when bruises marked my skin and my smile no longer reached my eyes, people continued to say nothing. They whispered in corners. They exchanged glances heavy with suspicion, but they never spoke aloud the truth that was visible before them. And each time they stayed silent, they gave him permission. Each unspoken word was a gift of power placed into his hands. I began to understand that silence does not protect the victim. It protects the abuser. This truth carved itself into me with a sharpness I will never forget. The darkness of the basement wasn't just the absence of light. It was the absence of voices, the absence of intervention, the absence of humanity. I learned that silence can kill in ways more brutal than violence, because it allows violence to continue unchecked. My isolation was not only physical, it was reinforced by the very people who claimed to love me, but who loved their own comfort more. The echoes of their silence haunted me even louder than the sound of the lock clicking shut. In every shadow of that basement, I saw their faces turned away, their lips sealed, their eyes focused elsewhere, and I realized with a piercing clarity that I was not only trapped by him, but by all of them. Their silence had built the walls of my prison just as much as his hands had closed the door. His footsteps echoed against the concrete stairs before I could even see him. Every time he came down into that basement, the air grew heavier, as if the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. My heart would begin to pound so loudly that I could hear it in my ears, drowning out every other sound. And yet I forced myself to remain still, to breathe quietly, to shrink into myself, as if becoming smaller might make me invisible. But nothing could shield me from the weight of his presence. He carried with him the certainty of someone who believed he owned me, body and soul. And with every visit, he made sure I understood just how powerless I had become. He never needed to raise his voice. His silence was more terrifying than words, and when he did speak, his voice cut through me like ice. He told me I was his possession, not his wife. He reminded me that no one above us would ever come to my rescue, that their silence proved he could do whatever he wanted. Each word was calculated, delivered with the cruel precision of someone who understood that breaking a spirit is far more permanent than breaking a body. The physical violence came in waves. Sometimes it was sudden, the sting of his hand across my face, leaving a heat that spread like fire. Other times it was slower, the grip of his fingers tightening around my arms until bruises bloomed in shades of purple and blue. He knew exactly how much force to use, how to hurt without killing, how to leave marks that I would later hide beneath long sleeves and lowered eyes. But the pain of his hands was only half of the torment. The real cruelty was in the way he looked at me while he did it. Eyes that showed not anger but ownership, as if each bruise was nothing more than a signature carved into my skin. There were moments when he would press his weight against me, pinning me to the cold floor of the basement. The smell of damp concrete mixed with the sharpness of his cologne became a scent I would forever associate with fear. He would lean close, his breath hot against my face, and whisper things I cannot repeat without feeling my stomach turn. Promises of what he would do next. Threats of what would happen if I ever dared to resist. His words were like invisible chains, wrapping around me tighter than any rope could. What I remember most vividly are the moments afterward, when he would step back and stare at me as if inspecting his work. He did not see me as human in those moments. I was an object, a possession, something to be shaped by his cruelty. And when he finally turned and climbed the stairs, leaving me in silence once again, I would collapse into myself, holding my body as if I could keep the pieces from falling apart. The tears that came then were not only from pain, but from the unbearable humiliation of knowing I had been reduced to something less than myself. Psychologists often say that humiliation is more destructive than pain, and I learned the truth of that in those nights. Bruises heal, skin recovers, but the memory of being treated as less than human seeps into the soul and lingers there like a poison. I felt it spreading inside me, eroding my confidence, hollowing me out. Each insult, each touch, each strike took away a part of me I feared I could never get back. And yet, even in those moments of despair, my body betrayed me with small sparks of survival. I learned to count breaths in the silence, to steady my heart after each attack. I forced myself to imagine places beyond the basement walls, fields of grass, childhood memories of sunlight on my face, the sound of birds in the morning. It was the only way to remind myself that I was still alive, that I was still human, even if he wanted me to forget. The cruelty was not constant in its form, but constant in its presence. Some nights, he would ignore me completely, leaving me alone in darkness that stretched endlessly. And strangely, those nights were sometimes worse because the anticipation of his return was its own form of torture. I would sit there, listening for the creak of the stairs, unable to sleep, my body tense with dread of what might come. Waiting became as painful as the violence itself. I began to realize that he was not only attacking my body, but rewriting my sense of reality. He wanted me to believe that no one would ever help me, that the silence above meant consent, that I was truly alone. And in those darkest hours, when even hope seemed dangerous, I almost believed him. That was his greatest weapon, convincing me that escape was not only impossible but pointless. The bruises on my arms and the ache in my ribs were reminders of his power, but the true scars were invisible, etched into my spirit. I carried the weight of shame heavier than the weight of his hands. Shame because I had believed his lies, because I had smiled at the altar, because I had thought love could save me. Shame because part of me still clung to the hope that the man I once thought I loved might reappear, even as the monster in front of me proved again and again that he was gone. Every descent into that basement was another attempt to erase me, but with each attempt, a small part of me resisted. I do not know how I held on to that spark, but I did. Even when my body shook with fear, even when my heart ached with humiliation, there remained a tiny voice deep inside, whispering that this was not the end of my story. And though his shadow loomed large, pressing against me with the weight of ownership, the whisper inside me told me that I was more than his possession. That whisper became the only thing that kept me breathing, the fragile thread that tied me to the possibility of survival. It told me to endure, to wait, to find the strength to rise again. And as I sat there in the darkness, bruised and broken, I clung to that thread with everything I had left, because it was the only proof that he had not destroyed me completely. The first time I felt the lock turn for me and not against me, it was not freedom. It was hesitation, a moment where the door creaked open, and I was not sure if it was another trick, another test meant to remind me that escape was impossible. But something was different that night. The air felt lighter, as if the silence itself had grown tired of hiding his cruelty. My body trembled as I stepped toward the faint slice of light spilling through the doorway, uncertain of whether I had the strength to walk beyond it. Yet even in my fear, I knew that staying in the shadows meant death, not always of the body, but certainly of the soul. It was not a grand rescue, not a heroic act where someone swept me out of the darkness. It was smaller, quieter, like most true turning points are. A neighbor had noticed I was gone for too long. A friend had whispered about the bruises that never made sense. A question had been asked at the right moment, and the silence that had once imprisoned me finally cracked. It was the smallest crack, but through it came the first breath of air that did not taste like despair. I remember the first steps I took outside the basement after what felt like a lifetime. The air was sharp and cold against my skin, yet it carried a sweetness I had forgotten existed. The sky stretched endlessly above me, indifferent to my suffering, but for the first time, I felt it belonged to me again. The ground beneath my feet was no longer the damp stone of a prison, but solid earth, holding me up, reminding me that I was still here. My body was frail, my spirit bruised, but I was alive, and that was enough to begin. The days after were not easy. Freedom does not erase scars, and survival is not the same as healing. I carried the weight of shame, the disbelief of others, the endless questions about why I stayed, why I had not spoken sooner. They did not understand that silence had not been my choice, but my only option, that fear had bound me tighter than chains ever could. And yet, in their doubt, I found my voice. Slowly, painfully, I began to tell my story. Not because it was easy, but because silence had already taken too much from me. Healing is not linear. Some days I woke with strength, determined to rebuild, to reclaim every part of me he had tried to destroy. Other days I collapsed under the memories, unable to move, feeling his shadow pressing against me even when he was gone. But each time I rose again, each time I chose to speak rather than hide, I took back a piece of myself. My body healed. The bruises faded. My smile began to return. Not the painted smile of a wedding day, but a fragile, honest one born from survival. Over time, I learned that survival alone was not enough. I wanted to live. I wanted to breathe without fear, to love without chains, to walk into the world without feeling the weight of his hands on my shoulders. I wanted to reclaim not just my freedom, but my joy, and slowly, I did. I built new routines, surrounded myself with people who chose to see me, truly see me, not as a victim, but as a human being worthy of love and safety. I learned that my worth was not defined by his cruelty, nor by the silence of others, but by the strength I carried within me. The scars remain. Some are visible, faint traces on my skin that tell stories no one else can read. Others live inside me, reminders that healing does not mean forgetting. I carry them with me not as marks of shame, but as proof that I survived what was meant to destroy me. They remind me that even in the darkest basement, a small spark of resistance can survive, waiting for the moment to ignite into flame. When I look back on that day, the day I thought was the beginning of love, I see it now as the beginning of truth. It was not the fairy tale I had been promised, but it was the chapter that taught me the depths of my own strength. It showed me that even in betrayal, even in humiliation, even in captivity, there's a part of the human spirit that refuses to die, and that part of me is what carried me into freedom. Today, I tell my story not only for myself, but for anyone who has ever felt the weight of silence, who has ever been trapped by fear, who has ever believed that they were alone. You are not alone. Your voice matters. Your survival matters. And no matter how heavy the darkness feels, there's always a crack where light can break through. Thank you for staying with me through my journey, for listening to the words I once thought I would never be able to speak. Your presence here is proof that stories can heal, that voices can rise, and that silence can finally be broken. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength or the strength of someone you know, I invite you to continue with me. The next video is already waiting for you on the screen. Click on it and let us keep walking together, because healing is not done in isolation. It is built in connection, in courage, and in the choice to never remain silent again.